So what we were looking at on Monday, or began to look at, is a whole tradition of French landscape painting that evolved between about 1830 and as late as 1870, in which a new generation of artists are saying French landscape, the naturalistic landscape of France, is appropriate for landscape painting. We don't need to go to Italy. We don't need to paint a classical landscape. And we started to look at a number of artists, some of whom, like Millet, become in some ways strongly socialistic and republican, rather like Courbet, because within their landscape there's a predominant element of the peasant, and that is meant to make a statement about the times. Other landscape painters, for instance, Charles-François d'Aubigny, is very much focused in on the landscape itself. Now, some of these landscape artists incorporate some animals into them, some, as I said, peasants or farmers, but there's an increasing interest in reading the land and the landscape itself. D'Aubigny is one of those artists who are associated with the Barbizon school of painters. And I remind you, this was not a formal school of painters. It is simply a way to refer to a whole generation of artists who began painting in around the 1830s in the forests of Fontainebleau, south of Paris, and where there was a small village named Barbizon, where some of them lived for part of the year or rented rooms out in order to have a place where they could return after they had spent the day painting. D'Aubigny was trained in the classical tradition, and it was not until after his association with the Barbizon painters, and in fact his friendship with Camille Corot, whom you remember sort of started all of this for us, that he abandoned working in a studio and began working completely out of doors. And I need to emphasize again how revolutionary it is for a painter to work completely out of doors. That is not the tradition that's taught. It was something that would have been considered extremely difficult or inconvenient. But we're going to see eventually in the 19th century, one of the revolutions is the introduction of paint in tubes that's pre-mixed, that can be taken out, and you have less paraphernalia to take with you in order to paint en plein air, out of doors. D'Aubigny painted at Barbizon for the first time in 1843, and he returned there to the forests of Fontainebleau often. He eventually bought a boat, which he converted into a floating studio, and I show you here the artist in his floating studio. This is an etching by D'Aubigny, which shows himself, a kind of self-portrait, and you notice the entire back of his boat opens to the water, to the river, and to the landscape, and that he can certainly put down the anchor and stay and begin to paint. And this is, in essence, en plein air. D'Aubigny strove to capture the effects of light on the water. And his works become quite famous and significant for his ability to capture the way the sun looked at a certain moment in time in relation to the sky with clouds and the reflections in the water. This is a painting called Sunset over the Oise River. The date is 1865. Now, I do want you to notice something, and I'm going to just back up here for a minute. These are not, in every case, large paintings. You can see there are other canvases against the wall of the interior of his boat, and so they can tend to be somewhat modest in size. But they're extremely impressive in terms of the technique, because there just is a sense in D'Aubigny of something that's painted very directly, not premeditated, not manicured. Remember, I keep using that term, but he's really trying to capture the essence of the moment. His works were attacked by those in power. They were said, among other things, listen to this, to lack precise drawing, which of course was not the point of his work at all. It would not have been relevant for him to emphasize drawing in his works. One critic wrote of Daubigny, "It's really too bad that this landscape painter, who possesses such a true, such a just, and a natural feeling, is satisfied by an impression and neglects details to this extent. His pictures are but rough drafts, very slightly developed. Each object is indicated by an apparent or real contour, but the landscapes of Monsieur Daubigny offer merely spots of color juxtaposed." Daubigny, like the Impressionists who followed him, was willing to sacrifice some of the literal detail to come closer to what he thought was a truer expression of nature at that moment in time. We know that he traveled between 1870 and 71, and that in England he met Claude Monet. And it's going to be in 1872 that Monet is going to paint what is considered to be the first Impressionist painting. 1874 is the first Impressionist exhibition. Constant Troyon was the son of a porcelain worker. He had no formal training in Paris, but he did exhibit in the Salon beginning in the 1830s, and he did exhibit landscapes. He traveled to Holland and was a great admirer of 17th century Dutch animal paintings. And he began incorporating more and more animals into his landscapes. This is a work called Before the Storm, in which, again, we get an artist associated with the Barbizon School who is reflecting on one moment in time. Not a universal landscape, but a landscape that just, I don't know about you, but I can sort of smell the storm in the air by looking at this painting. It's as though he has captured the wind, and the coolness of the, and to some extent, intervals of stillness in the coming storm. Animal paintings were becoming extremely popular in France by the middle of the century, and Troyon was one of those who, as I said, began incorporating animals into his works. For instance, here's another work called Approaching Storm. And what we see here, and I want to juxtapose it with a Dutch animal painting, is Troyon actually showing the strong influence of Dutch Baroque painting of the 17th century with a number of cows down by the side of a river, very much based on his admiration for Dutch animal paintings. Animal paintings actually became extremely popular in France, as I said, and their success indicates the elevation of landscape and animal paintings, and that increasingly people were buying these kinds of paintings because they were pleasant. Again, they told of a kind of ideal time, or they referenced the countryside, again, in a century of increasing industrialization. One writer about the topic of animal paintings in the 19th century said, and this is a writer in the 20th century, said, "The cow in the living room became a familiar item. The success of these pictures may have been the result of increasing urbanization, a bourgeois nostalgia for the countryside, as cities became more crowded and more complicated and more mechanized." Critics praised Troyon's mastery of the anatomy of the cow with as much seriousness as they praised other painters' mastery of the human nude. Maria Rosa Bonheur specialized in painting animals. In fact, there's a very funny story about this portrait of Rosa Bonheur by the painter Edouard Duboeuf, and that is that she posed for him. He finished the painting. She received the painting, and then she took the painting and she painted a bull under her right arm. So she literally wanted the animal right next to her and changed the painting substantially by adding the bull. She was a great admirer of Troyon, the painter of cows, and she eventually bought a chateau near the forests of Fontainebleau, but she's not considered a member of the Barbizon school. She's an even younger generation now, learning from, working on the shoulders of the earlier Barbizon painters. Unlike Millet's representations of peasants, which imposed a kind of guilt or a kind of sentimental moral tone, Bonheur was preeminently a realist. And this is important because we're going to begin to talk about Edouard Manet today, who is one of the ultimate realists in the 19th century. Bonheur was a specialist in painting animals. She studied animals. She lived with animals in her house. They had access to every room in the house. She also visited animal fairs. She went to slaughterhouses to study the anatomy. She avoided what's called anthropomorphizing animals, meaning making pictures of little dogs who are kind of looking sad with their heads down, sort of taking on human kinds of characteristics. She wasn't interested in that. She wanted to try to channel the passion and the real animal itself and avoid any kind of romantic tendencies. She was the daughter of a landscape painter from the south of France. This is really one of the only ways that an artist could be trained still in France in the 19th century if you had an in. If your husband was a painter, if your father was a painter, if your brother was a painter, that's a way you're going to find and be able to be trained. She was trained by her father. And when her family moved to Paris in 1829, she continued her career and began showing in the salon by the early 1840s. By the Salon of 1849, one critic said of her work, "Mademoiselle Rosa paints almost like a man." So in other words, I mean, that is the most chauvinistic slap in the face, but it was a compliment. It was the highest compliment to say, a woman who can almost paint like a man, who's almost competent. Bonheur became internationally famous in 1853 with the exhibition of this work, The Horse Fair. This is an enormous painting. It's in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. It is 16.5 feet in length and over 8 feet in height. It's called The Horse Fair. The Horse Fair sold almost immediately to an English dealer and was subsequently purchased for $52,000. That's a huge sum of money in the 19th century. And it was purchased, so I don't know if you were wondering why it's in the Metropolitan in New York. I mean, it could have been purchased by them 10 years ago, but the fact is, the American Cornelius Vanderbilt of the Vanderbilts of New York was the purchaser, and he gave the painting to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So we are very lucky to have this, what one really could call a masterpiece. Bonheur was awarded all kinds of praise for this work. And she was awarded a first-class medal. Do you remember that's a gold medal at the Salon? She was therefore entitled to receive the Legion of Honor, the highest award that can be awarded to by the French government. However, because she was a woman, they couldn't give it to her, because a woman had never received the Legion of Honor. And so they refused to give it to her. She finally did receive the medal in 1864 under Emperor Napoleon III. I don't think he specifically gave it to her. He sent an envoy to give it to her. The horse fair represents a horse auction, with horses basically being paraded around in a kind of oval. Let me just go back to, before I showed you the detail, in the background, and again, I'm sorry this is so dark, but in the background there's a kind of hill here, and there are a number of individuals here who are present at the horse fair because they're obviously interested in buying horses. And the horses are paraded around so that these buyers can look them over and see how they look in action. And that's what we get in Rosa Bonheur's representation of the horse fair. Extraordinary understanding of these horses from multiple points of view, naturalistic, but in turn realistic, hardcore representation of this male-dominated horse fair. In fact, to avoid the harassment which happened to her so often when she tried to go to basically male venues, she submitted an application in 1855 to the French police to obtain a permit to be able to wear pants, trousers, because it was not appropriate for women at this time to wear skirts, anything other than skirts, and she wasn't going to wear skirts at the horse fairs and horse auctions that she was attending, and so I show you a copy of the permit. She had to get a letter from her doctor saying that she needed to wear trousers, and so she got permission. Again, in the work of Rosa Bonheur, we have someone who avoided the anecdotal, the anthropomorphic, and was really one of the great animal painters of the 19th century. It reflects also in its detail someone who has studied the animals, who knows the animals, and can represent them realistically, even within what is quite obviously a very carefully orchestrated painting.